Okay guys, so if you've done your homework correctly, you've downloaded 2.79 Blender, it's on your desktop, and it's ready to go. So we're just going to go ahead and open our Blenders. And first you're going to see a splash screen. Mine looks just a little bit different because I have recent projects that I had open. Yours might be empty, but we're not going to worry about this right now. We're just going to click away. And instantly you see that Blender has given us a cube, which we call the default cube, a camera, and a lamp right here. Alright, so this is your standard setup every time you open a new project. Right off the bat, when we start clicking around instinctively with the left mouse button, all we're doing is moving this cursor around, which is called the 3D cursor. Now, while the 3D cursor is important, and that's all well and good to move it around like that, we want to use the left mouse button to actually select objects. That would make more sense to everybody. So let's just all get on the same page and make sure that we go to File. Just go up here to File, find User Preferences right down here. Alright, click that, and you're going to find Input. If it's not already selected, go up here and click the Input tab, right? Highlighted in blue. And we're going to go down to the left here, select with the left mouse button. Alright, so now we can use that to select our objects. Save user settings, and then X out. Alright, so now when we click the left mouse button, we're actually selecting things. And we know that they're selected because they are highlighted in yellow. This means that they are the active objects. Highlighted objects in yellow are called active objects. So before we start navigating around, I know you're going to notice the user interface and all of the different gadgets and buttons and things that you have available to you, but that's all they are. They're options, okay? Just think of them as options and not obstacles, okay? Now, if you're still not reassured by that explanation, have no fear. So as you can see, I've taken the liberty and replaced all of the things that I don't want you to look at with repeated images of kittens, puppies, and Nicolas Cage's face. I think that makes Blender look significantly less intimidating, don't you? Now we can just focus on this area and this little bottom portion and maybe some of this top portion right up here. That's all I want you guys to pay attention to. So here we go. Okay, now, so you have everything situated. We're selecting with the left mouse button, but to navigate, to rotate your camera around your 3D space here, whoops, you're going to click and hold the middle mouse scroller, right? Click, hold, and drag the mouse as you're holding it down, and we are now rotating the camera around our 3D world a little bit, alright? Now, if you hold, let go of that, if you hold Shift and the middle mouse scroller button, you know, now we're moving the camera kind of generally in the same angle, but just moving it up and down, left to right, all that good stuff. And if you scroll the middle mouse scroller, you zoom in and out. Forward in, out, back, back goes out, forward goes in. Real nice, alright? And if you hold Control and the middle mouse button, and you're holding both buttons at a time, moving the mouse forward and backward, you're kind of zooming in a little smoother. Whereas if you were just scrolling with the middle mouse button, you would be scrolling by certain increments. And if you ever get too lost in your 3D world, you can hit the period key on the numpad, and it'll focus onto your active object. So remember, the period key will always focus onto your active selective objects or points or whatever you have selected, so you can always find your way back. So we've covered some navigation. Let's go and talk about object movement. Alright, so here we have our cube selected. So with that selected, by left clicking, if it's not already selected, we're going to hit G. And when we move our mouse around, you don't have to hold G down, just hit G once, and move the mouse around, you can just put it wherever, and then left click on the mouse to let go where you want it, or Control Z to put it back where it was, or you could hit G, and if you're moving it around and you realize you don't really want to be moving it around and you want it to just go back to where it was, you could just right click and it'll snap back to where it was. So you've released the object. As you can see, we have our axes. The red will always mean the x-axis, the green will always mean the y-axis, and the blue will mean the z or the z-axis, up and down, depending on how you're looking at it. And we can either move the object by clicking and dragging the respective axis arrows here on this controller. You can hold the green arrow, drag it along the y-axis. Again, you can right click to release it back to where it was. Left click and hold on the red arrow to move it along the x-axis. But we can also do it a different way with shortcuts, which is what I prefer to do always. You can, with your object selected, hit G and then Y, and automatically we're moving it along the y-axis here. Beautiful. Again, right click to release. Alright, G and X. Alright, just in that order. You don't have to hold them down or anything. Just G, X, move. Alright? We're moving it around the x-axis here. Only the x-axis, nowhere else. Okay? Right click to release it back into place, and then hit G and then Z, and now you're moving it along the Z or the Z axis up and down. So this controller isn't all that necessary once you get the feel for your shortcuts. Keyboard shortcuts are going to be very, very important in Blender. A lot of the buttons that you see in Blender that you don't need to worry about, you're going to be doing them in the shortcuts. So you can do just so many things with shortcuts alone in Blender. It's astonishing. So that's how you move an object around, by hitting G. I like to think of G as just generally moving it around, so you could think of it that way. So we've covered general movement, right? But we also have to cover scale and rotation, right? So if you wanted to make this cube bigger, with the cube selected in yellow, you would hit S, and then just drag your mouse out, and scale it out. Scale it in, make it tiny, make it big, left click to where you want the size to be, and now we've got a much bigger cube. Or we can Control Z to undo that. And if you've probably already guessed, you can scale along the X, Y, and Z axis. So you would do the same thing as you did with the G key. So you would hit S and Y to scale it along the Y axis, in and out, move your mouse, right click release, S, X, scale it along the X axis, or Control Z, undo that, or scale it along the Z axis, S and Z. Alright? Alright. Very good. Now we have our default cube back to normal. So we've covered scale, and now we can cover rotation, which is simply R. You hit R, and you can rotate the cube wherever you want. And if you've probably already guessed, you can rotate it along the axes as well. RY, along the Y, RX, rotate it along the X, right? RZ, rotate it, remaining upright along the Z axis, so it can just spin if you wanted it to. But we're not animating just yet. So we've covered movement, scaling, rotation, navigation. Let's cover duplication, alright? If we wanted more than one cube, we would hold Shift and D with the cube selected. Shift D, alright? And just move it out, and now we have 2 cubes. And then we can hit Shift D again with that cube. And now we have 3 cubes. Now we can cover selection, alright? So we have our duplicated cubes here, but only one of them is selected. So if we have one selected, we can hold Shift and click this one, left click, and then keep holding Shift and click this one, and now we have 3 cubes selected, alright? And guess what you can do now? You can hit Shift D, drag it out, and now you have 6 cubes. Okay, so that's one method of selecting, right? To deselect, we can just hit A, and now nothing is selected. But we could hit A again, and now everything is selected, including the camera and the lamp. So everything in the scene is selected by hitting A. We can hit A again to deselect all, A, select all, A again to deselect all. Alright, perfect. Beautiful. We're moving right along here. So with nothing selected, let me show you some different selection tools that we have at our disposal here. We have the box select. If you hit B, this brings up this crosshair thing, and then you can just click and drag, like if you were just clicking and dragging in any other program with your left clicker. And we can just kind of get all our boxes into that box. Let's release. Well, it kind of selected the lamp and the camera as well, but this is a bad example. Hang on. Hit A to deselect. Hit B again. Now let's select all our cubes. Okay. Now we have all of our cubes selected, so that has selected all of the cubes within that square, if that makes sense. I think that's pretty straightforward. So A, that's good, but we also have to learn how to add objects. As I showed you before, when we were moving around our 3D cursor, I said that it's important, okay? And why it's important is when you're creating a new object, and you do that by holding Shift and A, that brings up our new objects menu here. We can add a new mesh, which is the option that we're going to be choosing most often in Blender. We're going to add, say we want to add, I don't know, a UV sphere. Any object that we add will be directly where the 3D cursor is. So we can go ahead and hit X to delete it. Just hit X once. Hit X to delete any selected object that you have. Click, hit X, delete, click, hit X, delete, click, hit X, delete. Knowing that every object appears where the 3D cursor is, if we wanted to, let's say, move this cube over, and we wanted our object to appear at the center of the grid, which is very important if you're working in symmetry, you would want the cursor and all of your objects that you're working with to be perfectly symmetrical and in the center of the axes here. So to be technical, we would want the 3D cursor to be in the exact center of the grid. So what we would want to do by doing that is holding Shift and S, and that brings up the snap menu, alright? And we would want to bring the cursor to the center here. So right now, that snaps the cursor back to the center. So if you're accidentally right-clicking somewhere, which you're often going to do, you can always just hold Shift, S, cursor to center. Alright? Okay. And if you wanted to bring the shape that you're working with back to the center, with its origin point right here in the center of its geometry, this little yellow dot here, by the way, right here in the center of our cube, that is called the origin point. That'll be more important later on, not so much right now, but if we want to bring this back to the center where our 3D cursor is, to be super technical about what we're doing, hold Shift, S, bring the snap menu back up, and then we are going to bring our selection to our cursor. And our cursor, remember, is in the center of our grid. So boom! Our object is in the center of our grid. Alright? Okay. So I think I've just about covered everything I wanted to cover in object mode in the 3D viewport here, right? Now let's venture on down here to these little tools right underneath our 3D viewport. This, by the way, is called the 3D viewport. I don't know if I made that clear enough, but that's what we call our 3D viewport. Alright? Okay, so we were just in object mode all this time, alright? So these tools are going to more or less change when we enter into edit mode, right? So if we go into edit mode, this allows us to really get into the nitty-gritty of our object, the composition of our object, what makes our object look the way it does, and that is the geometry of our object. And edit mode allows us to manipulate our object, the geometry, the makeup of our object. So now we are in edit mode, And if we click on a point of our cube, this is called a vertice. We can click and drag our vertices anywhere we kind of want them to be. So click and drag. We can manipulate our object even further in edit mode. Control Z, I'm just hitting Control Z repeatedly to go back to how it was. And let me be clear that pretty much all of the shortcuts that we covered in object mode also apply to edit mode, just to more specific parts of our object. So if that makes any sense at all, if we were to hit G, if we had a vertice selected and we hit G, Y, and drag it along the Y-axis, we're just moving one vertice along the Y-axis here. So that's vertices, we're just moving around our vertices of the object, but we can also get to the edges of our object by hitting Edge Select. We were currently in Vertice Select, but now we can edit the edges of our object by hitting Edge Select. So now if we select our edges here, we're just selecting an edge of our object, which is basically two vertices at a time, or one edge, one line. We can also go to face selection. Now face selection allows us to edit the whole side of our object, the whole face, the whole plane that makes up part of our object. Not very exciting right now, I realize that, I'm sorry. Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. Right. Okay, or we can go back into object mode and hit Control Z. And that brings us back even further. Okay, so now we're back in edit mode. You can also, by the way, the shortcut to get back into edit mode and object mode, toggle them both, you hit the tab key. Tab in edit mode, tab into object mode, tab into edit mode, tab into object mode. Alright, so now we're back in object mode, but we're in edit mode now. Okay, so I've covered vertice selection, edge selection, and face selection, alright? If we wanted to add geometry to our cube here, and I'm going to turn this little tool off right here. I don't like working with it so much, so I'm just going to turn it off by clicking on it, and it kind of just goes away. So by adding new geometry to our shape, we could just hold Control R, and that brings up this kind of pink line. And depending on where you hover the cursor over your object, that line is going to change either parallel or horizontal or vertical. I don't know what I'm saying. Say we wanted to make like a vertical cut into our object. We confirm the cut by left clicking, and then it kind of just slides over, but we can right click to center it perfectly in the center of our cube. So now we've made a nice cut into our cube here. Right? So now, if we go into face selection, we can see that the cube has been divided in two. Right? Sort of. And you've created more geometry to that cube, so you can manipulate it even further. Like, if we wanted to make a very abstract looking chair, we could just move this along the y-axis, and boom! You get a weird looking abstract bench or chair. I'm in object mode now, scale it along the y-axis. Now it's a bench. Look at that. Low poly bench. We're making stuff already. Pretty cool. Alright. I'm gonna Control Z. With this edge selected, I could just hit X and dissolve edges, and it will go away. Okay, so say I wanted to take our cube and make it into a more complex object and really build upon that cube and make it to where it's no longer just a simple cube anymore. Really get into what modeling is. The magic happens when you start extruding, and you do that by hitting E. If you have a face selected and you hit E on the keyboard, you can drag the mouse out, and all of a sudden you're adding way more geometry than you had before. It's like you have 2 cubes now. 4 more faces. It added 4 more faces to our shape here when we just extended one face outward by hitting E. You can turn one simple object into a very complex model just by using the E key and some other transform keys with it. So, for example, let me see if I can explain this properly. If I have a face selected here, right, and I hit E on the keyboard, and I don't do anything with the mouse, right, I just hit S after I just hit E, right, hit S on the keyboard. Now we're scaling our new extruded plane into the square, into the cube. So if we wanted to make this small, say we're making a hammer, right, we would just scale this to about here, right, and then we would hit E again and then drag our mouse out, and we start to have kind of a shaft of a hammer, right? Okay, we have the beginning of a hammer model. Pretty cool, right? Alright, wait 1 second. Okay, so if we're not happy with how long it is, we can just hit G and then X, because after all we are on that red X-axis, so we would drag it along the X-axis, make it longer, and then left click. Okay, so now we have a nice meat tenderizer looking thing. Then we would hit E again and then S, scale it out, right? Now we have the beginning of a handle, left click, right? Alright, and then hit E again and then drag it out. If you notice, it's automatically extruding along the X-axis when you just hit E, so that's pretty cool. And then hit E again, and then S, scale it down. Right. That looks good. Hit E again. Right. Now we have a handle. Left click. Once you're happy with that. And then maybe we want to add an ending to the handle, maybe. E again, S, scale it out a little bit. Right, like about there. Okay. E out. ES and E out again. Right? Okay. Cool. Okay, so right away we see that we have kind of a weapon, a low poly weapon taking shape, right? Alright. Okay, so let's make this look like more of a hammer. Okay. So I'm in object mode now, tab into edit mode. Let's select this face, select with the left, and then hold shift and select this face on the bottom and the top, right? Okay. Now if we go down here, this is the pivot point. We're going to control the pivot point by choosing individual origins, because when we extrude, they will go up and down respectively, if that makes sense. I'll show you what I mean. So if we hit extrude now, you will see as we drag out our mouse, now they're extruding on either side, up and down. So now we kind of have a hammer here, and left click when we're happy with that size. Alright, now with that still selected, we would hit E and then S, scale it just like we did with the handle. Alright, and then E again, scale it out, not scale it, but you know, extrude it, drag it out, click when you're happy with it, left click when you're happy with it. Alright, are we happy with that? I don't know. We could hit E and then S, scale that back in. And then E one more time, and then drag the mouse out. Okay. And then we can go back down here and change our pivot point back to median point, which is what you'll use more often. But that was just a particular case where we wanted this to be even with this and the same thing to happen on the bottom as it did on the top. Okay, so now we have a hammer. Pretty cool. A low poly looking hammer. Let me just briefly show you what the proportional edit tool does down here. This is called the proportional edit tool, and you can activate it by hitting O on the keyboard or just enabling it down here, and it'll be active when it's blue. So with that selected, if we had, like, say, vertice selection active, okay, say we wanted to select this vertice and shift click select this vertice so that both are selected at a time, and we wanted to hit G or something, right? Maybe use our scroller on our mouse button to make that circle bigger, and you can see that we can edit the object proportionally with the rest of it. The other vertices are following where we are dragging the one vertice. Instead of dragging one vertice at a time and editing the object that way, we can edit it more organically. Like, say we wanted to make more of a Fortnite looking axe that looks really warped and wonky, we could just click and drag a vertice and the other vertices will follow, and it can no longer look like a nice straight looking hammer, right? Look like you're ready to chop down some trees, but this is a hammer, so that doesn't make sense. Well, Fortnite doesn't make sense, so who cares? And it all depends on how big the circle is, which you can control, again, with the scrolly button. If you wanted to make it super wonky, make the circle a lot bigger, and it'll control these vertices as well. A little bit of these too. Okay, so that was edit mode. Now I just want to explain the different shaders in Blender. First of all, we have been in Blender Render this whole time, but most tutorials, including mine, we will be working with cycles. So Blender Render is the oldest render engine of Blender. It was around since it first came out, but people have switched to cycles and prefer cycles because of the realism that it provides, and it's just the render engine that pretty much everybody uses now. So we're going to be switching to cycles render. So now that we're switched to cycles render, I can explain the shaders. So now we've been looking at this in the solid shader this whole time. Pretty plain gray, but we can switch to, say, wireframe, and we can see all of the geometry that makes up our object. We can see right through it. So we were just in solid. Texture, if it had texture, it would show it. We didn't add any texture to our hammer, so don't worry about that. It has no material, so it's just by default white, so we're in materials mode. And now we get into rendered, which more closely resembles how your picture would look. If you were to make a render and a final image, it would look more like this. So this is more representing the final result of what you're going for. Doesn't look like much right now, so let's go back to solid mode. Let's Shift A, select a plane. Now our plane is in the center of our grid. G, Z, bring the plane down a little bit. Let's give this hammer a floor to lie on. Hit S, scale it out. Scale it out a bit more. Oops, scale it. Alright, left click. Nice looking floor. Okay, we're gonna Shift A, make another plane. GZ, bring that plane up. Scale that plane out. Alright, where am I going with this? Okay. G, bring the plane, angle it a bit. this plane is going to be another light source. So we're just going to scale it out. Okay. Now that we have this set up, I can talk about our materials panel, when we make stuff look cooler. Alright, so let's get rid of Nicolas Cage here and reveal our materials panel. This is the properties panel right now with all these different tools in it. Let's drag it out so we can better see what we're looking at here. This is the materials tab in our properties panel. Okay, so we're going to click this circle thing, and right now we have our plane selected, right? So with our plane selected, we're going to click new, and it added a diffuse shader to our plane. So if we switch to, say, material, no, if we switch to rendered, we would see that, I don't know, it's still gray, it looks like, but we want to give it a light source. So we're going to hit diffuse, go up to emission, and now we have a light source. So it's giving off light and shining it onto our hammer. Okay, so now let's go back to object mode, no, solid shader. Click our hammer. Let's give that a material as well. Hit use nodes. Now we want to make our hammer shiny. Let's go back to rendered so we see what we're doing here. And hit diffuse surface. Give it a glossy BSDF. So now we kind of give it more of a glass metallic look to it. We can control that by hitting roughness and dragging, clicking and dragging the roughness up a bit. Kind of give it more of a metallic look, less than a glass look, but more metallic looking. We can bring this down. The color, I just clicked color, and now I'm just controlling this right here. I'm just clicking and dragging down to where I'm happy with the color. We can make it gold, bronze. Just clicking around to all the different colors that we have available. Right? Now we have kind of a gold, warped looking low poly hammer. This is very low poly. I think we have to add more geometry to it because it doesn't look that hot. Down. You can spend hours just messing around with the materials on an object. It's super fun. Okay, I'm back in solid mode now. This is not a natural way for the hammer to rest, I feel. So let's just rotate, hit R, and we are on the x-axis, RX. Now we're rotating the hammer kind of like it's laying down. Right. And then we can hit G and Z so it's resting on our floor. Bring it down a bit. Rotate RY so it's kind of leaning. The handle is on the floor as well. Alright. Bring it up just a tad. RY. Cool. It still doesn't look natural. RX. Maybe it's leaning this way. I don't know, guys. I think it was better the way we had it before. You can also spend hours just adjusting where you want your objects to be. Okay, whatever. It's beautiful. This is garbage. Say we wanted to maybe make our floor a little bit glossy as well. Add a new material. Glossy surface. And boom, it's resting on glass. Super cool. Turn the roughness up so it's not too glassy. You can also select your plane, hold Shift D, duplicate your lamp, your light source, rotate it, make kind of a more interesting lighting setup. Rendered, see how that looks. You can have a lot of fun just looking at your objects and how they look in rendered mode. It's a lot of fun. Okay, so now that we've made our hammer and we're happy with it, even though it's the crappiest looking hammer you've ever seen. I was just playing around. I wanted to show you guys some examples of how you can turn a cube into whatever. So, we want to render our very crappy looking hammer, right? So, whatever the camera sees here, right? This is the camera. That's what's going to end up in your final render. So, how do we control what the camera sees? Okay, so if we hit N, we bring up this second properties panel. There's like two different properties panels. There's one for the 3D viewport, and then there's this one all the way on the right. That's the official properties panel. But this one controls more of what you see in the 3D viewport, if that makes sense at all. Don't worry about all this. Worry about this right here. This is what I like to use when I'm rendering. I like to lock camera to view. So if you hit N, bring up the properties panel, lock camera to view under view here, right? Now, if you were to go down here to view and you were to hit cameras, active camera, or you could just hit 0 on the numpad, everywhere you scroll the mouse, you navigate the mouse, you rotate the mouse as normal, the camera is going to move with it. So this is a nice shortcut way that I like to use to adjust the camera. So adjust the camera the way you want it. And once the hammer is in a nice view for your render to your liking, you can go up here and hit render image, or F12 as a shortcut. And then Blender is going to generate a rendered image of your hard work. So once Blender has rendered our image, we can hit F3 to save our image wherever we want. Hammer 3, because this is the third time that I'm doing this. Alright, so we can save that. And now we have a nice rendered image that Blender has rendered for us. So we can hit escape to go right back to where we were. Just a couple more things I want to go over before I leave you. This up here is the outliner. This kind of shows you a list of everything that's in your scene, right? So the camera is the current thing that we have selected. If we selected the plane down here, it would see you would see plane highlighted in the outliner. Hammer is technically the cube. We can double click that to rename it hammer. And now we're a little bit more organized. Wanted to name this plane light. And then name this plane light 2. It's very important to stay organized in Blender, but a lot of us are not. That's the outliner, and you can turn off the visibility of said things. Like, we can make the floor kind of go away, but if we were to render it, it would appear because we have this camera thing selected. So if you don't want it to render at all, you would hit the camera, and then when you hit render, you'll notice that the plane is no longer there. The floor is gone, and we're just rendering the hammer and the light sources that are hitting it. So that's that. Hit escape. We can bring our plane back, both visually in the 3D viewport and rendered. So when we render it, we will be rendering our floor. And if we wanted to move our hammer to another layer, if we were working with multiple layers at a time, these are called layers, and we can simply hit M while in the 3D viewport and move it to these boxes, which mirror the boxes down here. So if we were to hit M with our hammer selected, click a box, we have now moved it to the second layer, and we can tell where it is because there's a dot here. So this dot signifies that there's an object in that layer. So if we wanted to move it back, we just hit M, move it back to our main first layer, right? That's very, very handy when you're working with a lot of different objects at a time and you want to stay organized. And then over here we have our translations, rotate, scale, mirror. I covered most of these in shortcuts, so a lot of these we don't need at all. This is the timeline. Not very important right now. If you were animating, it would be very important. If you just hit play, it kind of scrubs through. If this were an animation, it would play the animation through. But we just hit pause, and that's just the timeline that's there by default. And you can change all of these windows to whatever you're working with at the time. This means 3D viewport, but we can change that to a properties panel, just making a bigger version of what we've been looking at over here on the right. It's just a copy of it, but we don't want that. And the properties panel icon, it moves up here to the top left, which is a little bit confusing. You would expect it to see it down here to change it back to 3D viewport, but no, we would go up here to change that back to 3D view, and now you see that's down here. So it's a little bit confusing, but you would just change the different windows that you're working with. I mostly work with 3D view, dope sheet for animation, node editor for materials. If you had more complex materials, you wanted to make a different bumpy texture on your hammer, you would plug that into the materials and it would control what your hammer looks like more accurately, if that makes sense. So you would control the materials in more depth in the node editor. Don't worry about that right now. UV image editor would be for texture as well, but we want 3D view. So we can render our image and call it a day. Okay class, so that was Blender. I hope this helped you out a lot. I hope you got a lot out of this. We made a very ugly hammer today. If you have a render that you've made from this tutorial, it doesn't necessarily have to be a hammer. Whatever you got out of this tutorial and learned from it, made something, I want to see it on r/Blender Never Sleeps. It's not your official homework assignment. We're going to make our first official render in the next video, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And I think you guys are going to enjoy it a lot. But we covered enough ground today. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll explain further if I wasn't clear enough in this video. It was a lot, I know. It was a lot. It was a lot to film this, and this was my third attempt. I hope I did a good job. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials, and I will see you in the next one.